new inflation data just out, giving us another snapshot of how prices are trending, what direction they're headed for Americans. CNN's Matt Egan.
$38 trillion. That is the number hanging over every man, woman, and child in the United States of America. It is the national debt, and it is growing by roughly $6 billion every single day. The interest alone, just the interest, costs the federal government almost $1 trillion a year. That is more than the country spends on its military, more than it spends on education, transportation, and veterans benefits combined. Credit card debt just hit an all-time record, $1.28 trillion. Nearly 13% of that debt is now seriously delinquent, the worst since 2011. The average American household owes $155,000. Half of Americans say they simply cannot take on any more debt. Grocery prices are up 30% since 2020. Housing is up 34%, electricity 41%. Home sales have collapsed to a 30-year low. Mortgage rates have more than doubled. An entire generation of young Americans has been priced out of the most fundamental building block of the American dream. The yield curve, the single most reliable recession predictor in modern financial history, stayed inverted for a record-breaking 2 years. Economists at Bloomberg put the probability of recession at 100%. The Wall Street Journal surveyed 60 economists who predicted contraction. Warren Buffett, the most successful investor alive, has been selling stocks for 12 consecutive quarters, quietly hoarding almost $400 billion in cash, the largest war chest in corporate history. Every signal, every indicator, every expert, they all said the same thing. The crash is coming. And yet, the United States economy grew 4.4% in the third quarter of 2025, the strongest reading in 2 years. The S&P 500 returned nearly 18% for the year, its third consecutive year of double-digit gains. Corporate profit margins hit all-time records. Unemployment, at 4.3%, remains lower than virtually any point in the 2 decades before the pandemic. The American economy is not just surviving. On paper, it is thriving. So what is going on? How can an economy drown in debt, suffocate under inflation, absorb the largest tariff regime since 1938, fire hundreds of thousands of federal workers, watch its housing market freeze solid, and still refuse to crash? That is what this video is about. And the answer is far more complicated and far more unsettling than any headline will tell you. To understand why the crash never came, you first need to understand what is actually happening in the American economy, because the data tells a story that will surprise you regardless of which side of the political aisle you sit on. Let's start with GDP, the broadest measure of economic health. The United States economy expanded at an annualized rate of 4.4% in the third quarter of 2025. That was up from 3.8% the quarter before. For context, most developed economies would celebrate 2% growth. The US nearly doubled that. Goldman Sachs projects 2026 GDP growth at 2.5%. Deloitte is at 1.9. The Philadelphia Fed's consensus is 1.8. Even the pessimists are forecasting positive growth, not contraction. And here is the part that does not make the headlines. The United States is not just growing, it is growing faster than virtually every other developed nation on Earth. Since the end of 2019, US GDP has grown over 14%. The Eurozone managed 6.8%. The United Kingdom, 5.2%. Germany, the engine of Europe, grew 0.5%. Over 5 years, Germany's economy barely moved. The United States economy grew 29 times faster. Now, the labor market. In January 2026, the economy added 130,000 jobs.
And the data shows 130,000 jobs,
beating expectations by 75,000. The unemployment rate ticked down to 4.3%. Average hourly earnings rose 3.7% year over year, outpacing the 2.4% inflation rate. That means workers are, on average, getting real raises for the first time in years. But here is where it gets complicated. Those rosy numbers are hiding something. The Bureau of Labor Statistics revised 2025 job creation down by nearly 900,000 positions. That means the economy created far fewer jobs than we were told in real time. Monthly job growth averaged just 150,000, well below the pace of the prior 2 years. The St. Louis Federal Reserve described this as a low-hire, low-fire labor market. Companies are not collapsing, but they have stopped expanding. Think of it as a labor market that is treading water, not drowning, but certainly not swimming forward. And then there is inflation. The headline number looks good. 2.4%, down from a terrifying 9.1% peak in June 2022. Core inflation, which strips out volatile food and energy prices, has fallen to 2.5%. Progress is undeniable. But this is the single most important thing to understand about the economy right now, and almost nobody talks about it clearly enough. Inflation is the rate of change. It is not the price level. Prices are not going back down, they are just going up more slowly. Since 2020, the cumulative price increase on everyday essentials is roughly 29%, groceries 30%, housing 34%, car insurance 56%, electricity 41%. When you go to the grocery store and your cart costs $130 instead of $100, it does not matter that inflation dropped from 9 to 2. You are still paying 30% more. That difference between the rate and the level is the single biggest reason Americans feel like the economy is broken even when the data says it is growing. Here is the dirty secret hiding inside every positive GDP number. The American economy is not one economy anymore. It is two, and they are moving in opposite directions. The top 10% of income earners accounted for nearly 50% of all consumer spending in 2025. That is the highest share ever recorded. The top 1% of households controlled 32% of the nation's total wealth. The bottom 50%, 2.5%. When Nordstrom reports record profits and Delta Airlines celebrates packed business class cabins, that is the top of the K. When Dollar General warns about struggling customers and subprime auto loan delinquencies breach 6.6%, that is the bottom of the K. Both things are happening simultaneously in the same country, and both are real. Wage growth for the lowest income quartile has plunged from a peak of 7.5% in 2022 to about 3.5% by late 2025, the lowest in roughly a decade. Meanwhile, the highest income quartile saw wage growth hold above 4.5%. Spending by lower income households grew just 0.6% year over year in September 2025. For higher income households, it was 2.6%. Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics called this the growing gap between the wealthy and everyone else, adding simply, it's taken off. The share of GDP going to workers as wages has fallen to its lowest level in over 75 years. Let that sink in. American workers are receiving the smallest slice of the economic pie since before the Korean War, and the bottom half is borrowing to survive. Total household debt climbed to $18.8 trillion. Credit card debt hit a record $1.28 trillion. The personal savings rate collapsed to 3.5%, well below the historical 6 to 8% average. The pandemic savings cushion that once protected ordinary Americans is gone. So when someone tells you the economy is doing great and you cannot figure out why your bank account disagrees, this is why. The economy is doing great for the people at the top. GDP measures total output, and when the richest 10% drive half of all spending and the stock market hits records and corporations post all-time profit margins, the total output looks fantastic. It just has very little to do with your life. If the bottom half of America is struggling, how is the overall economy still standing? The answer lies in 5 structural supports that have combined to create something economists have never quite seen before. Pillar 1, the AI investment boom. Artificial intelligence is not just a Silicon Valley buzzword anymore, it is a measurable GDP driver. According to analysis by CNBC, AI-related investment contributed roughly 0.9 percentage points to real GDP growth in the first 3 quarters of 2025. That is nearly 40% of total growth coming from a single technological wave. AI-related capital expenditures were growing at over 50% year over year, and companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Meta collectively committed over $200 billion in AI spending. But it goes deeper than spending. In the middle of 2025, productivity surged by 4.1% in the second quarter and 4.9% in the third. In the normally sleepy world of productivity statistics, those are explosive numbers. Productivity is the economic free lunch. If a worker can produce more per hour, the employer can pay them more without raising prices. AI is enabling that across industries: coding, customer service, logistics, medical diagnostics, legal research. Economic historians are increasingly drawing parallels to 1995, when the internet unleashed a productivity wave that allowed the Fed to cut rates, killed inflation fears, and fueled a 5-year boom. If AI is the new internet, the US may have structurally raised its growth potential. But there is a warning. The Institute for New Economic Thinking argues that we may have reached peak generative AI in terms of current large language models, and that the investment boom could represent a speculative bubble. This subject matter can be hard to digest, but for most Americans, their personal financial situation is the hardest subject to approach and manage. But with the DollarWise budgeting app, you can finally take control. And since there's a free trial, you can see for yourself. Get a full picture, automate your budget, get powerful insights, and set real goals that change your life. Stop with the overcomplicated budgeting apps like YNAB that no one can figure out. No more being told what to do with Ramsey's Every Dollar. End up being sold a mortgage with Rocket Money, and don't let private equity own you with Monarch. Take the change you need with a budgeting app that was built for people like you, by people like you. Go to dollarwise.app or click the link below to start your free trial. That remains a minority view, but every tech bubble started as a minority concern. Pillar 2, fiscal stimulus on steroids. The federal government is running a $1.9 trillion deficit in 2026, nearly 6% of GDP. To put that in perspective, the historical average deficit is 3.8%. The United States is running wartime deficits during peacetime. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, signed into law in 2025, made the 2017 tax cuts permanent, eliminated income taxes on overtime pay for over 80 million hourly workers, expanded the child tax credit, reduced taxes on Social Security benefits, and increased the small business deduction from 20 to 23%. The White House claims this will boost GDP by nearly 5% over 4 years and increase take-home pay for a family of 4 by over $10,000. Critics, including the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, say the bill will add $3.4 trillion to deficits over the next decade, plus $700 billion in additional interest costs. Moody's already downgraded the U.S. credit rating in May 2025, citing runaway deficits. The question is not whether this stimulus is boosting growth right now. It clearly is. The question is what happens when the bill comes due. Pillar 3, the housing lock-in effect. Here is one of the most underappreciated reasons the economy has not crashed. The American homeowner is sitting behind a financial fortress, and they built it during the pandemic. Between 2020 and 2021, millions of homeowners refinanced their mortgages at historically low rates, many below 3%. Today, mortgage rates sit around 6%. That means if you refinance during the pandemic, your monthly payment is locked in at a rate that no longer exists. You are effectively immune to the Fed's rate hikes on your largest expense. Over 80% of outstanding mortgages carry rates below 5%. More than a quarter are below 3%. This is why the housing crash that everyone predicted never happened. Homeowners have no incentive to sell because selling means giving up a 3% mortgage for a 6% one. So they stay put, supply dries up, prices hold, and the negative wealth effect that destroyed the economy in 2008 when falling home values wiped out household equity and triggered a foreclosure cascade simply cannot happen in this environment. The flip side is brutal for buyers. Home sales are at a 30-year low of just over 4 million units. The median home price is $414,000. Nearly 20% of new homes had price cuts in late 2025. An entire generation is locked out. Pillar 4, the Federal Reserve pivot. The Fed cut interest rates 3 times in late 2025, bringing the federal funds rate down to 3.5 to 3.75%. Goldman Sachs expects 2 more cuts in 2026. After the most aggressive tightening cycle in decades, the Fed is now easing, signaling that it believes inflation is sufficiently under control to shift focus towards supporting employment. Lower rates reduce borrowing costs for businesses, encourage investment, and provide psychological relief to markets. The fact that the Fed is cutting rather than hiking is itself a signal that policymakers believe the economy can achieve the fabled soft landing, taming inflation without triggering a recession. Pillar 5, America is the cleanest dirty shirt. In a global economy, capital has to go somewhere, and right now, everywhere else looks worse. Germany has been in stagnation or recession for 3 consecutive years, the longest economic malaise in 7 decades. Its manufacturing sector contracted for over 2 years straight after losing access to cheap Russian gas. The European Union as a whole is forecast to grow just 1%. China, despite reporting 5% GDP growth, is battling persistent deflation. a real estate collapse that has shaved an estimated 5% of GDP, record low births, and capital flight. The Rhodium Group estimates China's real growth is closer to 2.5% to 3%. Japan's economy contracted in 2 of the last 4 quarters. Its GDP in nominal dollar terms is essentially unchanged since the year 2000. So when global investors look at their options, the US, with its deep capital markets, energy independence, tech leadership, reserve currency status, and comparatively robust growth is the obvious choice. Money flows in. Treasury yields stay manageable, stock prices stay elevated. The US economy is propped up in part simply because everyone else is doing worse. The national debt stands at $38.6 trillion. Net interest costs were $970 billion in 2025, 3.2% of GDP. The CBO project's interest payments will double to $2.1 trillion by 2036, consuming 4.6% of GDP. At that point, interest payments alone will nearly equal all discretionary spending combined. The government will be spending as much on interest as it does on defense, education, infrastructure, and science put together. Most critically, the CBO warns that later this decade, the average interest rate on all federal debt will exceed nominal economic growth. That is the technical definition of a debt spiral, when you have to borrow just to pay the interest on what you already owe. Federal debt held by the public is projected to reach 101% of GDP in 2026, exceeding the nation's annual economic output for the first time since World War II. The DOGE initiative, despite cutting roughly 270,000 federal employees, a historic 9% reduction, has not moved the needle. Total federal spending actually increased. The budget is dominated by Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest payments. You cannot solve a $2 trillion deficit by firing regulators. You have to address entitlements, and that remains a political death sentence for both parties. The current tariff regime is the most aggressive since the Smoot-Hawley era of 1930. The effective tariff rate has surged from roughly 2% to between 15 and 23%. There are 10% baseline tariffs on virtually all imports, 145% on Chinese goods, 25% on automobiles, and sector-specific duties across steel, aluminum, and other categories. Yale's Budget Lab estimates these tariffs slowed real GDP growth by 0.5 percentage point in 2025 and will reduce it by another 0.4 in 2026. Payroll employment ended 2025 approximately 490,000 jobs lower than it would have been without tariffs. Consumer prices rose an estimated 2.3% due to tariff pass-through, equivalent to roughly $3,800 in lost purchasing power per household. The administration argues tariffs are necessary to rebuild American manufacturing, punish unfair trade practices, and generate revenue. And there is evidence they have boosted manufacturing output by about 3%, but that gain was more than offset by contractions in construction, agriculture, and mining. The Tax Foundation projects tariffs will reduce GDP by 0.8% over the next decade before accounting for foreign retaliation. And there is a legal wildcard. The U.S. International Court of Trade unanimously ruled the IEEPA tariffs illegal. The Supreme Court is now weighing the case. If tariffs are struck down, the fiscal picture changes dramatically because they are a key revenue source in the administration's budget projections. While the residential housing market is frozen in place, commercial real estate, specifically office space, is experiencing the crash that the broader economy avoided. Office delinquency rates have spiked to a record 12.3%. Buildings in major metros are selling for 40 to 60% below their pre-pandemic peaks. The industry faces a maturity wall of roughly $936 billion in loans coming due in 2026. Loans that were originated at 3 to 4% interest and must be refinanced at 6 to 7% on properties that have lost half their value. Why has this not toppled the banking system? 2 reasons. First, regulators and banks are engaging in what the industry calls extend and pretend, modifying loan terms to avoid recognizing losses immediately. Second, the exposure is concentrated in regional banks with less than $100 billion in assets, painful for those institutions but not systemically catastrophic. The crash is happening. It is just being amortized over years instead of days. Credit card delinquencies at 12.7%, auto loan delinquencies at 5.2%, student loan defaults surging after the end of pandemic forbearance, the personal savings rate at 3.5%. The stress is concentrated among younger and lower income borrowers, the segment most sensitive to any further deterioration. If unemployment were to rise meaningfully, say above 5%, the combination of high debt, high delinquencies, and reduced income could trigger a consumer spending pullback that reverberates through the entire economy. The consumer is the economy. Consumer spending drives 70% of GDP, and right now, a significant portion of that spending is being fueled by credit, not income. Perhaps the most bizarre feature of the 2026 economy is this. Americans, by and large, say their personal finances are okay. 73% say they are doing at least all right. But when you ask them about the economy as a whole, 72% rate it as only fair or poor. How is that possible? How can most people say they are fine but the economy is terrible? Part of it is the cumulative price shock we discussed. Part of it is the K-shaped divide. But there is another factor that economists are only beginning to fully quantify: partisanship. Consumer sentiment now tracks party affiliation more closely than it tracks GDP, income, or employment status. When Donald Trump won re-election, Republican assessment of the economy surged immediately. Democratic assessment plummeted, the underlying data did not change, the president changed. Economic confidence has become a tribal identity marker. If your side is in power, the economy is great. If not, it is a disaster. Gallup polling shows Democrats at 85% negative on the economy, Republicans at 45%. The gap is not explained by income, geography, or employment. It is explained by the letter next to the name in the White House. On top of this, the media ecosystem amplifies negativity. Studies from the Brookings Institution have quantified a negativity bias in economic reporting. Bad news generates significantly more engagement than good news. Social media algorithms feed the cycle. A video titled "The Dollar Collapse is Coming" will always outperform one titled "GDP Grows at Moderate Pace." The result is that the average American is consuming a diet of economic catastrophism that has very little relationship to the data, and it is shaping their worldview, their spending behavior, and their votes. This matters because sentiment can become self-fulfilling. If enough people believe a recession is coming, they cut spending. Businesses see lower demand and lay off workers. And the recession arrives, not because the fundamentals demanded it, but because the fear created it. Take a moment and get some free, easy money. With a Chime checking account and my link, you can get $350 when you set up direct deposit and pair that with a nation-leading high-yield savings rate. There's literally no reason not to sign up right now. Chime.com/Caleb or link in the description below. No honest assessment of the American economy in 2026 can ignore immigration because it has become both an economic variable and a political flashpoint. During the pandemic recovery, immigration, both legal and unauthorized, played a significant role in filling labor shortages. Estimates suggest immigrant workers added roughly 1 million to the labor force annually during the recovery, filling gaps in agriculture, construction, hospitality, and healthcare that native-born workers could not or would not fill. Multiple analyses, including from the Congressional Budget Office and Brookings, found that immigration contributed meaningfully to GDP growth and helped moderate wage-driven inflation by expanding the labor supply. The current administration has taken a dramatically different approach. Immigration enforcement has intensified. The federal workforce dedicated to deportation has expanded. Visa processing has slowed. The result is a measurable shift in the labor market. Native-born employment hit record highs in late 2025, while foreign-born employment declined. Supporters of this approach argue it is tightening the labor market in ways that benefit American workers directly, putting upward pressure on wages, particularly in lower-skill occupations, and restoring rule of law. Critics argue it is removing workers from industries that depend on immigrant labor, particularly agriculture and construction, and that the long-term effect will be higher prices and slower growth. The data so far is mixed. Wages at the bottom have stabilized, but labor shortages in specific sectors are intensifying. Agricultural producers in California and Texas have reported difficulty finding workers. Construction, which is already down 4.1% due to tariff impacts on materials, faces additional labor pressure. The economic impact depends entirely on scale and duration, and on whether displaced demand for immigrant labor is filled by native workers, automation, or simply goes unmet. It is worth remembering that this is not the first time experts predicted a crash that never arrived. In October 2022, Bloomberg's recession probability model hit 100% for 2023. 60 economists surveyed by the Wall Street Journal predicted GDP would contract. Federal Reserve economists forecasted recession. What actually happened? The economy grew 2.5% in 2023, with positive growth every single quarter. The experts were wrong. Spectacularly, unanimously wrong. In 1990, economist Ravi Batra's best-selling book predicting a devastating recession was so widely read that the publisher titled it The 1990 Recession. The recession never came. The 90s turned out to be the greatest economic expansion in American history. In 1999, experts predicted the Y2K computer bug would crash the global economy. General Motors budgeted $565 million for preparation. The millennium arrived with virtually no disruption. The common thread is that economic systems are more resilient and adaptive than models predict. Consumers, businesses, and policymakers adjust their behavior in response to threats. The United States in particular benefits from structural advantages that forecasting models consistently underweight: the world's reserve currency, the deepest capital markets on earth, a flexible labor market, massive scale, and an extraordinary capacity for innovation. That does not mean crashes never happen. They do. 2008 happened. 2020 happened. But the pattern is clear. They are almost never the crashes that everyone sees coming. The dangers that blow up economies are the ones nobody is watching. The expert landscape in early 2026 reveals a striking convergence toward cautious optimism, even from historically bearish voices. Nouriel Roubini, the economist nicknamed Dr. Doom for predicting the 2008 crisis, now calls the US economy best positioned among advanced economies and projects continued growth as his baseline. That is perhaps the most notable shift in macroeconomic commentary this decade. Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, struck a balanced tone, bullish on AI, saying it is not a bubble, but deeply concerned about geopolitics, warning that he is much more worried about geopolitics than the economy. Goldman Sachs projects above consensus growth, putting recession probability at just 20%. JP Morgan is slightly more cautious at 35%. But Warren Buffett's actions tell a different story. Berkshire Hathaway has been a net seller of stocks for 12 straight quarters. The company is sitting on nearly $400 billion in cash. The Buffett indicator, which measures total stock market capitalization relative to GDP, stands at over 217%, the highest in 25 years. Buffett is not panicking, but he is not buying either. And when the most successful investor in history decides to hoard cash at a record pace, that is worth paying attention to. The bond market, often called the smart money, signals moderate growth expectations. The yield curve has fully uninverted after its historic 2-year inversion, with a healthy positive spread between long and short-term rates. Credit spreads remain tight. There is no panic in the plumbing of the financial system. The IMF, however, issued a pointed warning: U.S. growth rests on a surprisingly narrow foundation of tech sector spending. Chief economist Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas stated the current setup leaves virtually no room for error. Path 1. The 1995 replay. In this scenario, AI proves to be a genuine transformative technology on the scale of the internet. Productivity growth sustains at 3 to 4%. The Fed continues cutting rates into an economy that is growing without overheating. Corporate investment accelerates, the labor market stabilizes, the deficit, while high, becomes more manageable as GDP growth outpaces interest costs. The US enters a new economic golden age, just as it did in the late 1990s. This is the bull case, and Goldman Sachs, RSM, and several Wall Street firms are positioned close to this view. Path 2, the slow grind. This is the most likely scenario according to the centrist consensus. Growth continues but decelerates to below 2%. The K-shaped divide deepens. The housing market remains frozen, the debt continues to accumulate, tariffs act as a persistent drag. There is no crash, but there is no boom either. The economy muddles through, and the lived experience for most Americans remains one of financial pressure, stagnant mobility, and growing frustration. The biggest risk in this scenario is not economic, it is political. A dissatisfied electorate bombarded with negative information becomes increasingly susceptible to extreme policy proposals from both sides that could destabilize the very systems holding the economy together. Path 3, the reckoning. This is the bear case, and it does not require a single catastrophic event. It requires a confluence of smaller ones. AI investment disappoints, deflating the tech sector that drives 80% of marginal demand growth. Tariff retaliation escalates, tipping the balance from inflationary nuisance to stagflationary crisis. A loss of confidence in U.S. fiscal management. perhaps triggered by a debt ceiling standoff or a Supreme Court ruling that destabilizes tariff revenue, reprices Treasury yields sharply higher. The commercial real estate maturity wall forces regional bank losses that restrict lending. Consumer delinquencies spike as unemployment edges past 5%. None of these alone would crash the economy, but together, they could overwhelm the shock absorbers that have held everything together. This is the scenario Peter Schiff has been warning about. Not a stock market crash, but a dollar crash and an inflationary depression. It is the scenario the CBO's own projections point toward later this decade when interest rates on the debt exceed nominal GDP growth. So why has the US economy not crashed? Because it's structurally evolved. It is no longer the sensitive, manufacturing-heavy economy of the 1970s. Nor the highly leveraged housing casino of 2008. It is a diversified, technology-driven, energy-independent machine that is currently being supercharged by government debt, shielded by fixed-rate mortgages, turbocharged by artificial intelligence, and buoyed by the simple fact that everywhere else in the world is doing worse. The crash was avoided because the people who drive the numbers, wealthy households, mega-cap corporations, and AI investors, are doing extraordinarily well. The bad news you hear every day is not fabricated. It reflects the lived reality of the majority of Americans who are dealing with higher prices, stagnant real wages, rising debt, unaffordable housing, and a job market that feels like it has stalled. The most honest answer is this. The economy is stronger than the fearmongers say. It is weaker than the headline numbers suggest. And it is more fragile than policymakers want to admit. The crash was not avoided. It was deferred. And the bill, $38 trillion and counting, is still accumulating. The United States economy is not dying. It is running an ultra-marathon on painkillers. It can keep going for a long time. But the eventual reckoning, dealing with the debt, the price level, and the widening chasm between the people who own America and the people who work in it will be the defining challenge of the next decade. Whether that reckoning arrives as a sudden crash or a slow erosion, as a political crisis or a fiscal one, depends on decisions being made right now in Washington, on Wall Street, and at kitchen tables across America. The only thing history guarantees is this: an economy this unbalanced, propped up by deficits, asset inflation, and top-heavy spending, does not sustain itself indefinitely. But history also guarantees that the people who bet on imminent collapse have been wrong repeatedly for years. The crash is not here, but the clock is ticking.